My stepmother, Beatrice, had a voice like honey, laced with ground glass. It was at its most dangerous when it was at its sweetest. A quiet girl like Elara is a useful sort of furniture, don't you think? She'd said to a guest just that afternoon, her hand resting on my shoulder with a proprietary weight that felt more like a brand than a caress. I had been standing by the window, tracing the patterns of dust motes in a slice of sunlight, and her words had turned the light gray. I did not flinch. I had learned long ago that flinching was a form of currency, and I was bankrupt. I was a creature of corners and corridors, a ghost in my own home. Since my mother's death and my father's hasty, regrettable marriage to Beatrice, my world had shrunk to the size of my bedroom and the pages of my books. My father, a man sculpted from apology and regret, drifted through the house like another phantom. His presence felt only by the absence of his protection. My stepsister Rosalind was the sun around which our small, unhappy planet turned. She was beautiful in the way a summer rose is beautiful, effortless, bright, and universally admired. I was the thorny stem, necessary for her support, but best left untouched. Beatrice ensured it. My passion, my only secret rebellion, was architecture. In the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, were my drawings. Fantastical cathedrals with buttresses like praying hands, sensible cottages with hearths large enough to warm a whole family, bridges that spanned impossible chasms. On paper, I could build worlds that were solid, logical, and safe. In life, I was as substantial as a shadow. The defining act of my humiliation was not a single sharp event, but a slow, grinding erosion of self. Yet, the evening of the annual Founders' Day dance felt like a culmination, a final masterpiece of Beatrice's casual cruelty. The town's most eligible and most vile bachelor was Mr. Abernathy, a man whose wealth was as vast as his appetites were crude. He was old, with a wet cough and eyes that stripped you bare. Beatrice, desperate to elevate our family's flagging social and financial standing, had decided I was the price. "Elara, dear," she'd murmured, fixing the limp bow on my drab gray dress. The dress was a statement, a declaration of my own insignificance. "Mr. Abernathy has taken a special interest in you. Isn't that lovely? A man of his station." She smiled, and the reflection in the hall mirror showed the truth of it. A predator's gleam. "He values a placid temperament." I was led to him like a lamb. He stood near the punch bowl, his bulk straining the seams of his waistcoat. He smelled of stale cigars and cloying cologne. My father hovered nearby, his face pale and strained, while Rosalind laughed with a group of suitors across the room, oblivious. She was not cruel, my stepsister. She was simply living in a different story, one where the light was always golden. "Here she is," Beatrice trilled. "My shy little Elara." Mr. Abernathy's gaze crawled over me. Plain thing, but sturdy. Good hips for heirs, I suppose." He reached out and pinched my arm, his fingers digging into the muscle. I felt a wave of nausea. I looked to my father, a silent, desperate plea. He looked at the floorboards, studying them as if they held the secrets of the universe. In that moment, I understood he was not just weak. He was a willing accomplice to my erasure. It was then that the music faltered. A hush fell over the assembly hall, a wave of silence that started at the door and rolled through the crowd. I turned my head, grateful for the distraction. He had arrived. Caleb Blackwood. The name itself was a piece of local folklore. He owned the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that stretched to the horizon. He was a man made of rumor and shadow, rarely seen in town since the tragedy that had claimed his wife and child years ago. They said he was as hard as the granite on his land, his heart buried with his family. He stood in the doorway, tall and severe, his black coat stark against the cheerful decorations. He didn't survey the room, he dissected it, his eyes missing nothing. The air crackled with his presence. He was not a guest, he was an event. The town's mayor scurried over to greet him, but Caleb's attention was elsewhere. His gaze swept past the preening debutantes, past the powerful landowners, past my beaming stepmother. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, and then it stopped. On me. For a heartbeat, the world ceased to exist. It was just the suffocating grip of Abernathy's fingers on my arm and the unnerving stillness of Caleb Blackwood's eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in them I saw not pity, but recognition. It was impossible. I was designed to be overlooked, a masterpiece of social invisibility. To be seen by him, a man who saw no one, felt like being struck by lightning. Abernathy, oblivious, gave my arm a shake. "Well, girl, cat got your tongue?" Beatrice laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. She's just overwhelmed by your attention, Mr. Abernathy. Caleb Blackwood began to move. He walked directly toward our small, miserable group, parting the crowd like a ship through water. He ignored my father's fumbling attempt at a greeting, ignored Beatrice's sycophantic smile, and stopped directly in front of Abernathy. He was taller than him by a head, his presence reducing the other man to a blustering fool. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet authority in his tone was more potent than any shout. "Take your hand off her," Abernathy sputtered, his face turning a blotchy purple. "Now see here, Blackwood. This is a private—" Caleb's gaze flickered down to the offending hand, and then back up. He said nothing more. The silence was absolute, a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. Abernathy, under the weight of that silent command, snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. I rubbed my arm, the phantom pressure of his fingers still there. Caleb then turned his attention to my father. "I came to discuss a business proposition," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "But my timing is poor. I see you are in the middle of a transaction." The word transaction hung in the air, ugly and true. My father flushed with shame. Beatrice, however, saw an opportunity. "Mr. Blackwood, what an honor. Perhaps we can all discuss it. We were just celebrating a potential alliance." Caleb's eyes met mine again, and for the second time, I felt that jolt of impossible connection. He was seeing the cage I was in, the bars polished by my family's smiles. "My proposition is a specific one," he said, his gaze unwavering from my father. "I am in need of an archivist. My family's estate has generations of architectural plans, ledgers, and correspondence that need to be cataloged. It requires a meticulous mind, a knowledge of structural design, and an appreciation for history." He paused, and the silence stretched. "I am told your daughter, Elara, possesses such a mind." The room was so quiet, I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. Beatrice's smile froze on her face. My father looked utterly bewildered. "Elara?" he stammered. "But how would you know?" "I make it my business to know things," Caleb said simply. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, a check. "I am prepared to offer a generous retainer for her services, say, for the first 6 months of her work." He named a sum, a figure so astronomical, so precisely calculated that I knew, with a dizzying certainty, he had somehow learned the exact amount of the debt Beatrice intended to settle with my soul. He had not just intervened, he had declared war. He placed the check in my father's trembling hand. "She will, of course, need to reside at the ranch to have access to the archives. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, will see to her comfort. She can begin tomorrow." It was not a request. He then did the most astonishing thing of all. He turned to me, the piece of furniture, the ghost. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Elara, I look forward to your work." And then he was gone, leaving a wake of shattered expectations and my stepmother's murderous stare. I had been plucked from my corner, from my carefully constructed invisibility, and placed into the center of a story I did not understand. For the first time in a decade, I felt the terrifying, unfamiliar flutter of hope, a thing with wings as fragile as a moth's, beating against the prison of my ribs. The journey to Blackwood Ranch was a silent one. I sat beside Caleb in his sturdy wagon, my meager belongings in a single trunk behind me. The town and my family receded into a cloud of dust. Beatrice had not spoken a word to me, her fury a cold, dense mass in the house. My father had pressed a few coins into my hand with clammy fingers, his eyes filled with a useless sorrow. Only Rosalind had shown a flicker of something human. "Be safe, Elara," she had whispered at the door, her blue eyes clouded with a confusion that was almost empathy. I did not know what to say to the man beside me. He was a myth made real, a savior whose motives were a complete mystery. I stole glances at him. His profile was harsh, carved from the same unforgiving landscape we were traveling through. His hands, holding the reins, were large and calloused, yet they moved with an easy competence. He did not seem to feel my gaze, or if he did, he gave no sign. Why? The question screamed in my mind. Why me? Was this pity? A rich man's whim? A strategic move in some game I couldn't comprehend? I had learned to be suspicious of kindness. It was often just a more elaborate sort of trap. I steeled myself against the hope that had flickered to life, trying to smother it before it could burn me. The ranch appeared as the sun began to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. It was not a place of elegance, but of stark, enduring strength. The main house was built of dark timber and river stone, solid and unpretentious, as if it had grown from the earth itself. It was surrounded by barns, corrals, and the lowing of distant cattle. It was a world away from the frills and suffocating propriety of my father's house. It felt real. A woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun and an apron as white as snow was waiting on the porch. This was Mrs. Gable, the loyal retainer. Her expression was formal, her posture rigid. She looked me over with a critical eye, and I felt myself shrink, reverting to my old habit of trying to take up less space. "Mrs. Gable, this is Miss Elara," Caleb said, his voice softer than I'd heard it before. "She will be staying with us. Please show her to the east-facing room and see that she has everything she needs." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer. There was no warmth in it, but no malice either. It was the neutral gaze of a professional assessing a new piece of inventory. My room was simple, clean, and larger than any space I had ever called my own. It held a sturdy wooden bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe. But its true treasure was the window. It faced east, as he'd said, looking out over the vast, empty plains that would greet the sunrise. For someone who had spent her life staring at the oppressive wall of the neighboring house, this endless vista of sky and land felt like a pardon. Later that evening, after a solitary meal served in my room, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Caleb. He held a lantern in one hand, its golden light casting long shadows up the wall. "If you're not too tired," he said, "I'd like to show you the archives." I followed him through the quiet house. The air smelled of beeswax, old leather, and wood smoke. It was a masculine, comforting scent. He led me to a heavy oak door and opened it. My breath caught in my throat. It was a library. Not just a room with books, but a true library. A temple to the written word. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes of every shape and size. In the center of the room was a massive table, and laid out upon it were dozens of rolled-up schematics and leather-bound ledgers. This was my work. This was my sanctuary. He set the lantern on the table, its light illuminating the delicate lines of a blueprint for a long-vanished courthouse. I couldn't help myself. I reached out a hesitant finger and traced the drawing of a flying buttress. "It's beautiful," I whispered. He was watching me, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You have a good eye," he gestured to a chair. "Please." I sat, my hands clasped in my lap, feeling like a schoolgirl summoned to the headmaster's office. He remained standing, leaning against the edge of the table. The silence between us was not awkward, but charged, heavy with unspoken questions. I decided I could not bear the not knowing. "Mr. Blackwood," I began, my voice barely audible, "I must ask, why did you do this? At the dance?" For me, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the blueprint on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "Last spring, I was at the mercantile in town. You were there with your stepsister. She was looking at fabrics. You were near the back, by the hardware supplies." I tried to remember. It was a blur of errands, of trying to remain invisible, while Rosalind charmed the shopkeepers. "The foreman for the new bridge was there," Caleb continued. "He was complaining to the clerk about a problem with the support structure, how the load distribution was all wrong. He was loud and confident and completely incorrect. He looked up from the blueprint and his eyes met mine. And you, standing by a barrel of nails, said, 'The stress would be better managed with a cantilever design.' You said it to yourself, a whisper. You didn't think anyone heard you." My heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered that moment. I had seen the flaw in the foreman's logic immediately, the structural weakness. The words had slipped out, a reflex from a part of me I always kept hidden. "The foreman heard you," Caleb said. "He laughed, called you a little blue stocking with too many books and not enough sense." Caleb's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "I stayed. I watched you. You didn't argue. You didn't defend yourself. You simply vanished. You pulled your shawl tighter and faded back into the background. But I saw you. I saw the mind behind your eyes." He pushed away from the table and walked over to a shelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound book. "I made inquiries. I learned about your interest in architecture. I learned about your family situation. And I learned about the plans your stepmother had for you in Abernathy." He placed the book on the table in front of me. It was a first edition of Vitruvius's De Architectura, a priceless treasure. "I do not abide bullies, Miss Elara, and I do not abide waste. A mind like yours, left to languish, or sold to a man like that, it is a profound waste." I stared at the book, then at him, my throat tight with unshed tears. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a whim. It was respect. He had seen the one true thing about me, the part I thought was locked away forever, and he had valued it. He had deemed it worthy of rescue. Over the next few weeks, a quiet routine settled over us. I spent my days in the library, lost in a world of ink and paper. The Blackwood family had been prolific builders and meticulous record keepers. I uncovered plans for the original homestead, a beautiful but flawed structure, and read letters detailing the triumphs and failures of its construction. I was not just cataloging, I was communing with ghosts, understanding the history of this place through its very bones. Mrs. Gable thawed slowly. She began leaving a tray with a pot of hot tea and a plate of biscuits on the library table for me each afternoon. One day, I found a thick wool shawl draped over my chair. "The evening chill comes on fast in this room," was all she said. But it was an act of quiet kindness that spoke volumes. I was no longer inventory. I was a person. Caleb and I rarely spoke during the day. He was out on the range from before dawn until after dusk, a tireless custodian of his vast domain. But in the evenings, he would join me in the library. He wouldn't interrupt my work. He would simply sit in the large leather armchair by the cold fireplace, reading one of his own books. His presence was a silent, grounding force. Sometimes I would ask a question about a name in a ledger or a notation on a map, and it would lead to a conversation. We spoke of building materials, of the challenges of the local climate, of the philosophy of creating a space that could withstand not just weather, but time. He was intelligent. His knowledge of his land and its history, encyclopedic. He listened to my ideas with a focused intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. My voice, once hesitant and small, grew stronger, more confident. I found myself gesturing with my hands, explaining complex structural theories, my passion overriding my ingrained shyness. One evening, I unrolled a particularly delicate blueprint. It was drawn in a different hand, lighter, more artistic than the others. It was for a nursery, designed as a wing of the main house. It was filled with whimsical details, carved animals on the window frames, a ceiling painted with constellations, and it was unfinished. The drawing trailed off in one corner, as if the artist had been interrupted mid-thought. Caleb had come to stand behind me, looking over my shoulder. His proximity sent a shiver through me, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire he had recently lit in the hearth. "I've never seen this one before," I said softly. "My wife, Sarah, drew that," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but the silence that followed was heavy with it. This was the forbidden subject, the great tragedy that defined him. I felt I had trespassed on sacred ground. "I'm sorry," I murmured, beginning to roll the print back up. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Leave it." He walked around the table and sank into his chair, staring into the flames. The firelight carved deep lines into his face. She was an architect, too. Not by training, but by instinct. She believed a house should be a joyful thing. He fell silent for so long, I thought the conversation was over. But then he spoke again, his voice so low I had to lean forward to hear it. "The fire. It started in the old wing, a faulty flue. It was the part of the house she wanted to tear down and rebuild first. She and our son, Daniel," he couldn't finish the name. He swallowed hard. "They were in the nursery she had just finished painting, the one she designed." The terrible irony of it stole the air from my lungs. The one place she had poured her love and creativity into had become her tomb. "I've been building things ever since," he said, his gaze lost in the fire. "Barns, fences, additions, trying to build something strong enough to keep ghosts out." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Or maybe trying to build a prison strong enough to keep them in." In that moment, he was no longer the powerful Caleb Blackwood, the lord of this vast ranch. He was just a man, hollowed out by a grief so immense it had remade the landscape of his soul. An impulse I could not control moved me. I stood up, walked to the fireplace, and knelt on the hearthrug. I didn't touch him. I just stayed there, a quiet presence in his orbit of pain. He looked at me, his storm gray eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that startled me. He had shown me the shattered foundation of his life. He expected me to recoil, to look away from the ugliness of his sorrow. Everyone else always had. When I did not, his expression shifted. The harsh lines of his face softened. He slowly reached out, not to my hand, but to the blueprint still open on the table. His fingers brushed against mine as he pointed to an empty space on the paper. "She was going to put a window seat there," he whispered, "so she could read to him in the morning sun." Our fingers touched. It was a brief, accidental contact, but it felt like a brand. A current passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of shared sorrow and a nascent, fragile connection. He held my gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw the ghost of a smile. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. It was the end of one kind of loneliness and the beginning of another, far more terrifying one, the loneliness of daring to hope. This fragile piece, however, was not destined to last. A writer arrived from town one afternoon with a letter. Mrs. Gable brought it to the library, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. The envelope was thick, creamy parchment, addressed to Mr. Caleb Blackwood in my stepmother's elegant, looping script. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Beatrice did not surrender. She reloaded. Caleb was in the study across the hall. I heard the murmur of his voice as Mrs. Gable delivered the letter. I tried to focus on the ledger in front of me, but the numbers swam before my eyes. The silence from the study was more damning than any shouting could have been. I sat there, my hands clenched into fists, waiting for the axe to fall. An hour passed, then another. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows into the library. Finally, his door opened. He appeared in the library doorway, the letter in his hand. His face was a mask of granite, his eyes as cold and distant as a winter sky. "Elara," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of all the warmth that had begun to grow between us. My heart plummeted. He walked to the table and laid the letter down in front of me. "I believe you should read this." My hands trembled as I picked it up. The words were poison, crafted with Beatrice's signature blend of saccharine concern and venomous accusation. She wrote of her worry for my delicate mental state, my tendency towards fantastical stories, and melancholy delusions. She claimed I had been obsessed with him for years, spinning elaborate fantasies about the reclusive rancher. She hinted at petty thefts, of money missing from the household accounts, painting me as a creature not just unstable, but deceitful. The letter concluded with a plea for him to send me home, where she could care for me properly before I caused him any more embarrassment. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, designed to turn his respect into pity, and his pity into disgust. Every line was a lie, but it was a lie built around a kernel of truth. My quietness, my solitude, my life lived in books, twisting it into something ugly and pathetic. I felt the familiar shame wash over me, the feeling of being small, wrong, and unworthy. The walls of the library, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like they were closing in. I finished reading and looked up at him, my throat too tight to speak. I expected to see contempt in his eyes. Instead, I saw a banked fire, a controlled rage that was all the more frightening for its stillness. "Is any of this true?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "No," I whispered, the word feeling inadequate against the weight of so many lies. "None of it." "I know," he said. The two words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stared at him, bewildered. You believe me?" "I don't need to believe you, Elara," he said, his gaze intense. "I believe in what I see. I have spent weeks watching you work. I have listened to you speak. The woman in this letter does not exist. This is the desperate act of a tyrant who is losing control." He picked up the letter and held it over the candle on the table. He did not look at it as it caught, curled, and turned to black ash. He watched me. "She has underestimated both of us." He let the last blackened flake fall to the table. "Go and pack a small bag," he said, his voice now crisp with purpose. "We are going back to town. There is a matter to be settled." The drive back was faster, harder than the first. The setting sun was at our backs, and we rode toward a reckoning. When we arrived at my father's house, it was dark. Lights glowed from the parlor windows. Beatrice was likely entertaining, cementing her social position now that I, the inconvenient baggage, was out of the way. Caleb didn't knock. He opened the door and strode in as if he owned the place. I followed in his wake, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. In the parlor, my father, Beatrice, and Rosalind were sitting with the mayor and his wife. They all looked up in shock. Beatrice recovered first, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "Mr. Blackwood, and Elara, dear, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you." She rose, gliding forward. "I trust you received my letter. I am so glad you've brought her home. She needs our care." "I did receive your letter, madam," Caleb said, his voice cutting through her pretense like a razor. "It is why I am here. We are not here for a social call. We are here to dissolve a contract." My father sputtered. "Contract? What contract?" Caleb turned his cold gaze on him. The one you made with this woman when you married her? The one that allowed her to systematically defraud your own daughter?" Beatrice paled. "I have no idea what you're talking about. This is slander." "Is it?" Caleb reached into his coat and produced a sheaf of papers, tossing them onto the polished table. "After receiving your letter, I had my lawyer in the city look into your family's finances. It was surprisingly easy to do. Once he knew where to look, he tapped the top paper. This is a copy of your first wife's will, Elara's mother. She left a considerable inheritance in a trust for her daughter, to be managed by her father until she came of age or married. An inheritance you," he said, his eyes locking on Beatrice, "have been pilfering for the last 10 years to fund your lifestyle and pay off your own family's debts." The room was utterly silent. The mayor and his wife looked horrified. Rosalind stared at her mother, her beautiful face a mask of disbelief. "The debts you were planning to settle by selling Elara to Abernathy," Caleb continued, his voice relentless, "were not family debts. They were your debts. You manufactured a crisis to justify disposing of the one person who stood to inherit what was rightfully hers." Beatrice's facade finally shattered. Her face contorted into a mask of pure venom. "She is a worthless, mousy little thing. She deserved nothing. I gave this family respectability. I gave that ungrateful girl a roof over her head. All my life, I had been silent. I had absorbed the blows, the insults, the casual cruelty, and I had held it all inside. But hearing her screeching, seeing her ugly soul laid bare, something inside me broke free. Caleb had built a platform of truth for me, and now, for the first time, I was going to stand on it. I stepped forward. My voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was clear and steady and filled every corner of the room. "You gave me a roof, but you made it a prison," I said, looking directly at her. "You called me furniture, but even furniture is treated with more care. You tried to erase me, to make me so small and quiet that I would eventually disappear altogether. Then I turned to my father, who was weeping silently into his hands. And you watched. You let it happen. You traded my happiness for a quiet life. A father's job is to protect his children, and you failed. You stood by and watched a stranger steal my mother's legacy and my future, and you did nothing." Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of rage, of grief, of a decade of suppressed pain finally finding a voice. Rosalind rushed to my side, her own eyes filled with tears. She took my hand, her grip firm. "She's right, Mother," she said, her voice trembling. "I never saw it. I was a fool. But I see it now. What you did to her, it was evil." Beatrice let out a strangled cry and lunged, not at me, but at the papers on the table, as if destroying the evidence would destroy the truth. Caleb caught her wrist in a grip of iron. "It's over," he said, his voice final. "You will pack your things. You will leave this house. If you are not gone by morning, these papers go to the district judge. You will be left with nothing." Defeated, Beatrice collapsed into a sobbing, pathetic heap. The tyrant was dethroned, the ghost had found her voice, and the man made of shadow and rumor had brought the cleansing light of truth. We returned to Blackwood Ranch under a blanket of stars. The air was crisp and clean, washing away the cloying atmosphere of my father's house. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for the enormity of what had happened. He had not just saved me from a terrible fate, he had given me back my own story, my own truth. He stopped the wagon, not at the house, but on a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The ranch house was a warm point of light below, a beacon in the vast, dark landscape. We got out and stood at the edge, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face. For a long time, we just watched the stars. They seemed impossibly bright and close, untouched by the petty cruelties of the world below. "They warned me, you know," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble beside me. "The gossips in town. They said you came with a painful past." I braced myself, waiting for the familiar sting of pity. He turned to face me, his tall frame silhouetted against the sea of stars. "They were wrong. You don't have a painful past. You have a past you survived. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Elara." My breath caught. He saw not a victim, but a survivor. He saw not weakness, but strength. "When Sarah died," he continued, his voice softer now, laced with a vulnerability that mirrored my own, "I thought the only way to honor her was to lock myself away with her memory, to build walls around my heart so high that nothing could ever get in again. But that's not living, it's just existing in a well-defended tomb." He took a step closer. The space between us hummed with a powerful, unspoken energy. Then I saw you. I saw this brilliant mind, this quiet strength trapped behind walls someone else had built for you. And I understood. You don't heal a painful past by trying to forget it or hide from it. He reached out and gently cupped my face, his calloused thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was not a brand of ownership, but a question, a comfort. I don't want to be the man who heals your past, Elara. I want to be the man who builds a future with you, a future so bright and so solid that it casts no shadows long enough to reach back there. My heart felt like it was going to burst. Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time in my life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. They say my ranch is my kingdom, he murmured, his stormy eyes searching mine. But a kingdom is just land and buildings. It's empty without a queen. Marry me, Elara. Be my partner. Be the architect of our life, together. It was not a rescue. It was a proposal between equals. A meeting of two souls who had learned to build, one with timber and stone, the other with ink and dreams. Yes, I whispered, the word a prayer on my lips. Yes, Caleb. He smiled then, a true, transformative smile that lit up his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound recognition. It was the end of a long, cold winter. It was the feeling of coming home. 1 year later, I stood on the porch of the newly completed Blackwood Town Library. My library. I had designed it from the foundation up. Every arch, every window, every shelf. Caleb had funded it, a gift to the town, but he had insisted my name be the one on the cornerstone. Elara Blackwood, architect. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. My husband came to stand beside me, his arm wrapping securely around my waist. He followed my gaze to the children running in and out of the doors, their arms full of books. It's a good building, he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride that was all for me. It's strong. It will last. I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and open air. My father, now a quieter, humbler man, was the volunteer librarian. Rosalind was engaged to a good, kind doctor, and often visited us at the ranch, her friendship a gentle balm. Beatrice was gone, a bitter memory that had lost its power to wound. In the pocket of my dress, my fingers found the smooth, worn leather of a small notebook. It was filled with new sketches, not just for buildings, but for a life. On the first page was a drawing of a nursery wing for the main house, a design that incorporated Sarah's unfinished blueprint, honoring the past, but building upon it. It had a wide window seat, perfect for reading in the morning sun. Caleb hadn't healed my past. He had done something far more important. He had stood beside me and held the light steady while I healed myself. He hadn't given me a voice. He had simply created a space quiet enough for me to finally hear my own. And I had learned that love was not about being rescued from the ruins, but about finding the one person willing to help you draw the plans for a new cathedral, right in the heart of them. I was no longer a ghost in a corner. I was seen. I was home.